Welcome to Creation Crochet, where beautiful is easy. Hello, today we are going to learn how to do the mattress seam. Now this is a seaming technique that I prefer for my garments because it gives you a nice flat seam and holds everything together well. It also helps to interlock the seam and keep the stitches nice and tight together. So when you do seaming, there are 3 different scenarios you may run into. And I've got some swatches here, and I'm going to show you each technique. The first way you'll be seaming is matching finished edges, so the top of a row or an edged row, to each other. You may also have to edge a finished row to a raw edge, or you may have to seam 2 raw edges together. Now, typically, if you're doing a shoulder seam is when you're going to do finished stitches to finished stitches. And if you're doing a side seam or sleeve seams, you'll probably have to work raw edge to raw edge. But if you're attaching a sleeve to the garment, you're probably going to work a raw edge into a finished edge. So let's start with doing a finished edge to a finished edge. Now, anytime you're doing seaming, my general rule of thumb is that you'll need 3 times the length of the fabric in yarn. So I just begin by doing 3 times the length of the fabric that I need to seam, and I cut my yarn to that length. You can just use any regular embroidery or sewing needle, whatever works best for you. And when you do any sort of mattress seaming, you're always going to lay your pieces flat, and you're always going to lay them with the wrong side facing up. So this is the right side of your row. You can see the top loops of both stitches. You want to work into the wrong side. So when you're looking into the wrong side of a row, you only see the back loop. You don't see both loops of the stitch. So you turn your work flat. You want to line it up, and we're going to seam this row right here. Now, when I'm doing my seaming, I like to lock in my first set of stitches, where my first set of seaming where I add my yarn. I like to lock that in a specific way that I'm going to show you. But I want to mention first that we are only going to be working in the back loops of our stitches. So you're going to work in the back loop only. Insert your hook into both sides, pull your yarn through, and now I like to go back in the same direction I started. I like to go back through again and pull my work tight. Now when I finish, I'll weave in this end, and that will help keep this tighter again. Now when you do the mattress seam, you don't go around. That would be a whip stitch. You're going to work back and forth. Okay, so we're going to start from this direction. Remember, we're going to go under the back loops only of the stitch, and we're going to pull the needle through. Now you don't need that tail in there. So I'm going to pull that tail out. And now you're not going to work back the same direction again. You're going to work from the opposite direction. So go under the first loop of that stitch, or the back loop only of each stitch. And you're going to need to pull your seaming yarn a little bit snug. You don't want to pull it too tight because you don't want to bunch your yarn up, but you do want it to be snug. Now I am using a very contrasting color just so you can see better, but when you do pull it snug, you won't really see the stitches, and from the other direction you won't see that at all. So this is the inside, again, the wrong side of your work. And if you were doing this on a garment, you would use the color of the same color as your fabric. If you are putting 2 different colors together, like I'm doing here, then you would just choose one of those colors to work with. So again, we just keep going in the one loop only, back and forth in opposite direction while the piece is laid flat. And again, just be sure to pull this snug. Don't pull it too tight so that your fabric bunches up. You just want to pull it snug enough to pull this yarn tight, but to make sure that the fabric pieces are not bunched up. And you just continue all the way down till you reach the end. I'm coming in on my end here, so I'm going to do my last stitch. Now I have turned my fabric this way as opposed to working this way because it's easier for me to work. You can work either way, works best for you. I just wanted to begin by showing you this way so it was a little bit easier for you to visualize. Now, just like I started the beginning where I wrapped the seam stitch all the way around, I'm going to do that on this last stitch as well. So I did my last stitch, my last seam. Now I'm also going to come back the same direction for this last one and pull it tight. Now that's just a whip stitch. And you can see the reason why we do a mattress stitch as opposed to a whip stitch when we are seaming our garments. And it's because it goes in between the fabric and doesn't add any extra bulk. And it is also much less visible. Where with the whip stitch, if we did this all the way across, we would see this loop on the inside and it adds a lot of bulk to that seam. So we finished this. Now to finish, we would just weave in our ends. And I want to show you from the right side of the fabric how nice and neat that stitch looks. Now again, you can see a little bit of this color popping through, but I used a contrasting color. If you were to use either the cream or the coral to do your seaming in this instance, you would not see any of that seaming at all. But it gives you a nice, neat, and clean edge. Now we're going to go over if we were doing a finished edge. So this is the nice finished edge of our stitches to the raw edge. Now again, you want to always work into the wrong side. So I've placed the right side of the fabric down, laid it flat, and I'm going to be working only into the wrong side. Same with this piece. This is the right side. Now even though I'm working into this raw edge, I'm still going to turn the work upside down. I have my yarn. Again, it's about 3 times the amount I need to seam. Actually, in this case, it's more because I measured against this edge and we're only going to be seaming this edge. Now, you do it the same way. You want to work under only the one loop. Now, it's a little bit different in this case because you're not working into a finished edge, so it's not as easy to find. You may, if you're doing a large piece, you may want to line it up and place stitch markers every 5 to 10 stitches to help you keep your place. But if you look in the side here, I'm still only working in the top stitch. I'm going to line it up the same way. The edges are going to be lined up the same way. And again, I'm going to come back from the same direction one time just to help firm up that first row. Now I'm going to be working back from the opposite direction. I'm going to pay more attention to my finished edge because that's going to help line me up. So I'm going to work into that one finished edge. And here you're just going to work whatever kind of naturally lines up with whatever is right next to that stitch of the finished edge. I'm going to turn it this way again because it's easier for me to work this way. Now this is my next stitch. So I'm just going to come through here. I'll find a spot that looks good. And I'm going to work into that stitch. So again, I have a nice even marker of where I'm going to place my seaming for a finished edge, not so much for a raw edge, but you kind of just work wherever seems to make sense, whatever is directly across from that stitch. And again, we're only working into the top loop of the fabric. So it seems a lot scarier to match raw sides, to seam raw sides, but it's really not. You just want to make sure that the edges of your fabric line up. And again, as I said, you may want to just place stitch markers every 5 to 10 stitches just to keep things lined up. So we have, it looks like I'm going to do about 2 more. So I've got one here. And I'm going to finish up with this one. And again, since I'm doing my last stitch, I'm going to come back from the same direction with this last one just to help lock it into place a little bit better. So you can see we have a nice straight seam. Again, we want to keep our working yarn snug to keep the stitches or the seam snug, but we don't want to bunch up our fabric. And you can see from the other direction, again, it gives us a nice clean seam. So this is doing a clean edge to a raw edge. For our last method of seaming, we are going to do raw edge to raw edge. Now this one can be a little more complicated because you don't have the guide of a finished seam to help you. I'm just lining this up in a way that's going to be easiest for me. So you don't have a guide of a finished edge to help line you up. This is where you'd really, your best bet if you weren't comfortable would be to place stitch markers every so often, maybe every 5 to 10 rows in this instance, to help keep you lined up correctly. In this case, it's a very small swatch. I'm just showing you how we're doing it, so I'm not going to use any stitch markers to line it up. I am just going to start on the first raw edge, and I'm going to work underneath 2 loops, just like we did if there was a stitch there to guide us. You just kind of need to imagine each row end as being a stitch, but we do it the same way. We come back from the opposite direction for the first one, just to lock it in place a little bit better. And now we come back from the opposite direction. So I'm going to turn my work so it's easier for me to see. And in this case, I'm just going to come back from the opposite direction. I'm going to only work under 1 loop of fabric. And I'm just going to continue to seam the same way we did the others. You really just have to take your time, work slowly. It doesn't matter if you seam in exactly the right spot, especially since we are working only in the back of the fabric or the back loops of the fabric. You're really not going to see that from the other side. You just want to make sure your stitches are placed evenly, not too far apart, and that you keep the working yarn snug, but don't pull tight. You can really put these seam stitches anywhere along the edges. You just want to make sure everything lines up. So we're coming to our last one here. And again, to lock that in, we're just going to work again from the same direction, just to snug everything up. So you can see again, the seam looks the same from the other side. We're going to look at the finished edge, and you can see we have a nice, clean seam. And you really can't tell if the stitches weren't lined up perfectly because it just kind of blends together. Now, I also want to show you if you happen to finish this and you realize that your seams are all messed up. They don't look the way you want them to. Just take your needle, just open up that 1 loop that you did, and all you have to do is just slightly pull your fabric apart and pull out your seams. Just work them one at a time. You could use your fingers, or you could use your needle, and you can just loosen the fabric up and pull the seam out as you go, which is another great benefit of using this seaming technique as opposed to a whip stitch. So the whip stitch, you have to pull out every single seam, where with the mattress stitch, you can just kind of open up your fabric and pull it apart.